now I want to get into the point that I really want to nail in terms of why corruption can be so damaging and why corruption specifically screwed the Russian military in the Ukrainian invasion, or at least it seems to. Adding corruption to your budget is not the same as just adding a line in the defense budget to purchase yachts and mansions. It's not a case of saying, okay, 20% of the military budget is reallocated from whatever it was going to buy, and it's going to buy yachts and mansions instead. In fact, if that was the case, cunning procurement officers, experts, and talented bureaucrats, I'm sure, would be able to look at the margin that's diverted to yachts and try and make do as efficiently as possible with the money that was left. The problem is this. The benefit of a particular piece of corruption, the value a person manages to steal in inverted commas, is often far less than the actual cost imposed on the organization. So let's just say a private strips down a reserve vehicle of its copper. A $2 million modernized T-72 gets stripped of its copper and its optics, and those get flogged for a couple of $1,000s. So maybe $5,000, $6,000 has been stolen from the military budget, but in exchange, $2 million of damage has been done because that vehicle is now useless. If you sell a few $100 worth of diesel, again, your vehicle is useless. Your unit is combat ineffective. If you appoint a politically connected idiot in exchange for a $10,000 bribe, then the unit he is leading is not combat effective because he's an idiot. A little bit of corruption ends up with you putting knockoff tires on your $25 million anti-aircraft system, while your $25 million anti-aircraft system bogs down in Ukraine and gets torched by a bunch of babushkas with Molotov cocktails. And if you're a private simply not doing your job, if you don't do your job in terms of maintenance or looking after kit, that might only cost the state nominally, say $30, your salary. You're just not doing your job. It's $30 stolen. But the number of vehicles and the decrease in combat effectiveness that has been damaged by you not doing your job is immensely greater. So it's almost the case that the lower the level of corruption, the more likely you are to have this multiplier. Because it's really simple to do kickbacks at the contract level, and the government also kind of knows. Like, it still knows, even in corrupt contracts, you know what you're paying for the corrupt contract. You're not getting value for money, but at least you can plan around the fact that the drone costs $100,000. Even if it should cost $20,000, you can plan your budget around the fact that it costs $100,000. It's hard to plan your budget around the fact that half the vehicles in deep storage have been looted for parts and scrap metal. That's a little harder to run a contingency around. And that leads into this point about how corruption is distributed. Corruption isn't efficiently distributed. As I said, it's not like you just have a line in the budget and then the government gets to take the 80% that's left and put it where it efficiently is left over. It gets stolen from wherever people could steal it. And it can introduce points of failure into very intricate systems for very low amounts of money. Military hardware, military units. Hoping most people listening to this would recoil at the idea of deliberately lying about something important like military readiness. So it's important to understand the motivation here. And to be fair, there are many, but the biggest reason, the overarching one, is that usually lying is simpler than having to deal with reality. If everyone can collectively agree to just ignore uncomfortable truths, then life can suddenly be a lot more comfortable and a job can be a heck of a lot easier. After all, I don't need to put a lot of energy into solving problems if there are no problems. And where that gets particularly perverse is where organizations are set up to reward liars and punish people who are honest. For example, one of the most common reasons that Russians accuse commanders or individuals in the military of lying is to secure promotions or look very good on evaluations or to win the game of internal politics. If I can just write a report saying that I've taken a bunch of fresh recruits and turned them into elite Spetsnaz-worthy warriors who could storm the White House, and that 100% of my vehicles are combat ready, and that my unit is elite and ready to go, and that gets me promotion, well, that's a pretty good incentive for me to write that report. And the flip side, of course, is there may be many honest officers or honest members of the military complex out there, or at least people who come into the military full of patriotic fervour, looking to do the right thing. But the system has a way of pushing those sort of people into line. Now, those pressures can be subtle and unofficial. Say, for example, you're operating in an environment and you want to be honest, but everyone else is lying on their reports. You're going to come out as the person with the worst readiness report, or the worst status report, or the worst combat performance, or the worst exercise performance, because you're being honest while the rest of them are just making it up, which means you won't be promoted. You won't gain more power, you won't gain influence, you may even be pushed out of the army entirely, So you're subtly pressured to set aside your morals and try and get yourself into a position of power where you can have more influence. But in getting there, you compromise your morals and lose a little bit of who you were. Or maybe by being honest, you mark yourself out as someone who rocks the boat, not a team player. Someone who's undermining the cohesion of the organization. You mark yourself as an outsider, and again, you no longer have the patronage or support that you require for promotion and advancement. Those are the sort of mechanisms you might see grow up in any organization, not just the Russian army. Again, success is likely. It is time to reinforce success, set up multiple echelons, and attack this position. Fortress Grad will be taken. Now, if you're listening, you might wonder, if General Oligarkov knows that some of these reports are likely to be bullshit, can't he just discard them? But that's not how accountability works in structures like this one. He can rely on the reports of his subordinates, and as long as he can rely on them and puts them into the mathematical model and makes the decision that the model suggests he should make, then he is in the clear. If he ad-libs, if he makes it up as he goes along, if he chooses to disregard the reports, if he chooses to be sensible about the whole thing, then suddenly his ass is on the line. But if he follows the system, if he takes into account those reports, then he's safe. There's an old Russian saying that the more paper you have, the cleaner your ass is. That is, the more paperwork you have to cover you, the better you'll survive any investigation. And General Oligarkov has a lot of paper from his subordinate commanders telling him that this attack, in no uncertain terms, is actually an excellent idea. And so Private Conscriptovich, halfway through trying to find a washing machine to send home to his family, hears that the unit is going over the top again. Just for a moment, let's play a little guessing game. Here's a photo of a German infantryman in 1942, and based just on his uniform, I would like you to guess, is he a member of the army or of the Waffen-SS? And some of you are already yelling at me because it is in fact a trick question. He's in the Air Force. The so-called Luftwaffe field divisions were raised in significant numbers from late 1942 onwards. What had happened is, because of the fighting on the Eastern Front, the German army realised it would need a lot more personnel and requested that they be transferred from other services to help them make up numbers. But Goering and the Luftwaffe didn't want to transfer personnel over to the army, and so they put forward a plan to raise their own infantry divisions instead. That way they could preserve their power and influence. And so something like 200,000 Luftwaffe personnel found themselves grouped into field divisions. Now, unsurprisingly, it turns out that the Air Force is less effective at forming infantry units than the Army is. And given their poor reputation and distinctive Luftwaffe field blue uniforms, the Soviets learned to pick on these units pretty relentlessly. Eventually, everyone learned their lessons, and the units were transferred over to the Army. But that didn't stop the Luftwaffe from maintaining control of a tank division until May 1945, when it surrendered to the Soviet Army. Nor did it stop the same saga playing out all over again in late 1944. By this point, it was very clear that everything was going downhill, and the decision was made to form the Volkssturm, a mass-levied militia of the very young and very old, to serve as a last-ditch defence for the German homeland. So with Germany's back against the wall, the question was which army would be responsible for raising, training and commanding the Volkssturm? The SS, the Army, heck, maybe even the Air Force. They still had a tank division at this point. And the answer the Germans came to was to place the Volkssturm under the command of local Nazi Party officials. Because politics and power games were never going to give way to military necessity, even as the bombs rained down on the German Reich. Now, I'm not saying this fragmentation made the individual forces useless, but I am saying all these systems were duplicative, wasteful, and made sense from a political perspective, not from a military or a logistics one. Which means it's time to head back to modern Russia, introduce some of the major figures, and the forces that they command. On one hand, you have the regular military, and specifically the regular army, most commonly represented by the Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, and the Chief of the General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, who is now the commander of Russian forces in Ukraine as well. Under its control, the MOD umbrella are the ground forces, the Navy, the aerospace forces, the strategic rocket forces, the airborne forces, the list goes on. And these are Russia's primary combat forces, but historically they've been viewed, as we've discussed before, with some degree of political suspicion. And so Russia has a second force of troops focused on internal security. Roskvardia takes over many of the duties you'd associate with the old Soviet internal troops. It has a domestic focus. In 2021, it had a moderate reported strength of nearly 340,000 personnel, And like any good police or internal security force, it had about 1,600 armoured vehicles and an artillery regiment. In a crisis, Rosvardia can take over command of individual military units as well with a presidential order. And who, you might wonder, has Putin selected to lead the Rosgvardia? Well, that would be Viktor Zolotov. And if you're wondering what qualifies Mr. Zolotov to lead an organisation of more than a third of a million men and women with more armoured vehicles than many militaries, well, he was Yeltsin's bodyguard, and then he was Putin's sparring partner, and then he was Putin's chief of security until 2013, which obviously made him fully qualified to become Minister of Internal Affairs in 2014 and to take over command of the National Guard in 2016. In short, he has very little in the way of relevant experience, but you don't appoint someone your chief of security for 13 years without trusting them. There was also another armed force, or rather pair of armed forces, that weren't officially part of the Russian army until well after the February invasion, and this is the armed forces of the so-called DNR and LNR. Russia leaned very heavily on these troops through much of 2022, and really paid the price for the fact that they were officially separate from the Russian army. Without access to the Russian treasury, full access to Russian armories and training grounds, many DNR and LNR units were more poorly trained, worse equipped, and worse paid than they otherwise might have been. In part as a result, casualties were very, very high. From a manpower perspective, that was incredibly wasteful. But politically, the separation of these forces from the Russian army long made sense. Politically, it meant that Russia didn't have to take responsibility for their actions, nor take responsibility for the casualties that they suffered. Even keeping these states separate, so having Donetsk and Luhansk separate and keeping their forces generally pretty poorly armed, had arguably a political purpose, keeping them both reliant and dependent on Moscow. But it also hampered joint operations and military effectiveness. On more than one occasion, it was reported that troops from Donetsk refused to go and fight in the territory of Luhansk, and troops from Luhansk refused to go fight on the territory of Donetsk. And when it came to leadership, again, loyalty and political connections probably mattered more than competence. Denis Pushilin, who was the ostensible head of the DNR for a number of years, while his primary pre-war qualifications include running a massive Ponzi scheme between 1989 and 1994, then running another Ponzi scheme in 2011 to 2013, or rather being involved in one allegedly, running in the December 2013 elections in Ukraine and winning 0.08% of the vote. Truly, Russia was sending its best. But these are just the forces that officially existed, that officially served the Russian Federation or its proxy states, the DNR and LNR. What about those that fit more into the category of private forces? Now, let's be clear. Private military companies, mercenaries, household armies, these things are illegal under Russian law. There's a provision in the Russian constitution which prohibits the establishment of organizations, the objective of which is to create armed units, among other things. Acting as a mercenary is also illegal under the criminal code. And this explains why you can go on the internet, find the website for Russian private military corporations, and express your interest in hiring their services. I've often seen analysts argue that the illegality of these organizations is in fact a political tool in its own. If an organization is illegal, then you have the ability to just arrest all of its members and wind it up if it ever ceases to be useful to you. And it means they can only exist as long as those in power permit them to. Which brings us to our first figure, Ramzan Kadyrov, who has managed to make his private army at least legal on the surface. Kadyrov is officially the head of the Chechen Republic. His dad was a major resistance leader who fought against the Russians. In 1995, Kadyrov said, if every Chechen kills 150 Russians, we will win, owing to the 150-to-1 population ratio. But in 1999, the Kadyrovs switched sides and were instrumental to victory for the Russians in the Second Chechen War. Kadyrov's father, Akhmad, was assassinated in 2004, and because modern governments are apparently monarchies, that meant Ramzan was now in charge. Now, I could make an entire video making fun of Ramzan Kadyrov. This is a guy who made a video of him slow motion running away from oncoming four-wheel drives before firing a machine gun into the air. This is a guy who leads one of the poorest places in Russia, and yet somehow seems to, always manage to accumulate a whole bunch of wealth. After his gala 2011 birthday party that brought together figures like Jean-Claude Van Damme and Hilary Swank, Kadyrov probably held the prize for weirdest Hollywood crossover, until the Belarusian president Lukashenko invited Steven Seagal over and gave him a carrot. Kadyrov is highly hawkish in Russian politics. He's been highly critical of the MOD. He was supportive of the former commander in Ukraine, Sergei Surovikin, and he's also one of those guys who's threatened, for example, Poland, saying that after they're done with Ukraine, Poland is next. And to help protect his influence, one thing Kadyrov has done with the money flowing to him from Moscow is establish a large, loyal, and very well equipped personal guard. These Chechen troops are usually very easy to recognize. Most of them wear full beards, and they tend to have much blingier equipment than their Russian army equivalents. While Russian regular infantry don't tend to have things like optics on their rifles, Kadyrov's troops, well, they look like they've got the full tactical setup. Now, as a warning, it would technically be wrong to call these units Kadyrov's private troops. Officially, on paper, they're part of official Russian fort structures. Many of their units are part of, for example, Rosgvardia. But I'd humbly suggest that when you're talking about units that put the Kadyrov name on their insignia, the face of his dad on their units' flags, that are recruited almost solely from populations and areas considered loyal to him, that maybe, just maybe, the loyalty of these units is more focused on Kadyrov himself than the Rosgvardia command structure. And that gives Kadyrov influence. Nothing builds political acumen like a small army on your payroll. But if you're going to talk about people with an army on their payroll, it's impossible not to talk about Yevgeny Prigozhin and the Wagner Group. And we've talked about Prigozhin before. He served time in prison, but then when he got out, he got rich off catering contracts with the Russian government. Having made his money in catering, he decided to move into other traditional business areas, like running a mercenary group, likely in cooperation with the GRU. And it is Wagner Group that has driven Prigozhin's rise in power and influence over the last 12 months. Now, Wagner really could be a video all of its own, but here is the cliff notes. Because private military corporations are illegal, Wagner obviously doesn't exist, which is why it has T-90M and T-90S tanks, heavy artillery, the ability to recruit prisoners directly from Russian prisons, a massive HQ in the center of Russia, and is integrated directly into Russian war planning. Now, there is actually a Wagner corporate registration in Russia, I believe, for management consultancy services. So I'm really looking forward to seeing these guys pitch their solutions against PwC or McKinsey next time you have a business problem. That gentleman in the lower right-hand corner with the SS tattoos is Dmitry Utkin, reportedly one of Wagner's commanders, awarded several medals by Putin, and he looks like someone who has fantastic PowerPoint skills. Wagner was a relatively small force before the war in Ukraine, but with recruitment from Russian prisons and elsewhere, Western intelligence agencies believe the group grew to as many as 50,000, and at places like Bakhmut and Soledar, has reportedly become one of Russia's primary offensive infantry forces. And of course, Wagner's existence as a separate organization means it has its own headquarters, its own command staff, its own recruitment pipeline, its own training facilities, and even some of its own logistics and sustainment. Then there are a mix of volunteer units, which again have their own recruitment, training, selection, and equipment processes, many of which have rather complex relationships. So, for example, there was reporting on a volunteer unit that was formed in Moscow, paid for by the Moscow structure. But jokes aside, I'm not going through this list to take some cheap shot at Russia. I'm not trying to argue that all these units must be combat ineffective. Clearly, Wagner has some combat capacity, for example. I'm doing it to show how political incentive and self-interest can create some truly atrocious organizational structures. From a logistics, from an organizational standpoint, this is a complete shit show. It's entirely duplicative. You have all of these different parallel systems of recruitment and training. You have different tactics being taught. You have different equipment being issued. You have different pathways for obtaining and supplying equipment. And you have parallel command structures, each with their own interests. From a purely utilitarian perspective, it would make sense to simply combine all these units together under one roof. Make use of all the training grounds to their maximum effectiveness. Use the trained personnel in one organization to help train the mobilized personnel coming into another. Streamline the supply system, all of that. But within the rules of the game, when you take account of politics and self-interest, this makes perfect sense. If all of Wagner's troops were just folded into the army, for example, what happens to Prigozhin's influence? If there were no centers of competitive power, say everything was consolidated under the army, then how would Putin divide and conquer in order to maintain his power? If there was nothing to counterbalance the army, well, then how would you prevent the army in the medium to long term starting to get ideas? And so these duplicative and wasteful structures are likely to remain because no one has any incentive to do things differently. And politics and factionalism does more than create duplicative structures that waste resources. It cuts at the core of the ability of these Russian forces to coordinate and fight as a team. As I said at the start, ideally, war brings everyone on one side together to use all the forces and capabilities at their disposal in order to win the collective conflict. But whether it's in war or business, sometimes it's in an individual's interest that someone else fail, sometimes even more than it's in their interest for the collective as a whole to win. To go back to our corporate example from earlier, we've already established Rob might not have any reason to share his resources with Susie. But if he and Susie are both going for the same promotion, the same role, well, things get even worse. Because now Rob and Susie have an incentive to make sure not only that they do well, but that the other person does badly. Now, I'm not saying Rob's about to set up an IED in Susie's car or anything, but if he can find a way to make her look bad in front of a client or maybe sabotage her work in some subtle and deniable way, then maybe that's a good idea from a personal perspective. Shifting that problem of incentives into a military context doesn't change the concept that much, it just makes the consequences that much more deadly, and increases the cost to the nation in question. Good example here is Japanese inter-service rivalry in World War II. Now, given the type of people who watch my channel, I imagine many of you already know this, but here's a quick primer if you don't. During World War II, the Japanese Army and the Japanese Navy absolutely hated each other. They were each backed by completely different zaibatsu, massive industrial conglomerates. They each had completely different ideas of how Japan should conduct itself in the world. The army, unsurprisingly, wanted to fight a land war in Manchuria, China, and eventually the Soviet Union. The Navy, also unsurprisingly, wanted to fight a largely naval war in the Pacific. Each effectively appointed their own ministers, and inter-service assassinations were not unknown. Insubordination was possible even at strategic level. When the Japanese Kwantung Army invaded Manchuria, it did so against the wishes of the government in Tokyo. As with Germany, this manifested in duplicative structures. Which service had Marines? The answer is both. Which service had paratroopers? The answer is both. Which service had an air arm? The answer is, of course, both. And which service had transport, shipping, and escorts? Again, the answer is both. In fact, the Imperial Japanese Army operated a considerable navy over the course of the war, including transport submarines and escort aircraft carriers. Of course, building these required all sorts of weird workarounds because the Navy controlled the shipyards. If you're interested in the story of the Imperial Japanese Army Navy, I will link a video by Drac in the description. But more than just problems of inefficient organization, the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy had a deep problem with coordination and cooperation at a strategic and operational and a tactical level. At a strategic level, they both wanted to fight their own war with their own objectives. And at an operational or tactical level, things like intelligence intercepts or analysis in many cases simply just wouldn't be shared, because the other service was an enemy almost as much as the Americans or the Chinese were, and heaven forbid the army give the Navy a chance to look good. To cite an extreme example, the Navy quite famously didn't really tell the army when it lost at Midway, and you can't play divide and conquer without any division. And in that sense, you can start to see the relationship between these political incentives and the other topics I've covered, corruption and the culture of deception. These three phenomena interact in a way that probably isn't unfamiliar to those of you who lived in several Warsaw Pact states, or post-Warsaw Pact states for that matter. The political incentives explain why leadership have every reason to create divided and duplicative structures to set subordinates against each other and to select people based on loyalty rather than competence. Corruption functions both as a motivation, that is, a reason people want to climb to the top of the totem pole in the first place because there's opportunities for self-enrichment to be had, but also as a tool for securing loyalty. Whether this takes the form of buying loyalty by turning a blind eye to corruption, giving someone a job they don't deserve, or directly paying kickbacks, or whether it takes the form of using corruption charges, because everyone is guilty, to eliminate anyone who tries to rock the boat or challenge your power doesn't really matter. It's a critical component regardless. And because government based on patronage, loyalty, and competition and corruption isn't really the best and most efficient way to run a country, it'll always mean the army is weaker than it should be, that industry is less profitable and productive than it should be. And at that point, lies step in to reject reality and substitute it with something more acceptable, so that the corruption and the system can go on. Previously, I used the word vranio. A more accurate one might be, and apologies to any Russian speakers for this pronunciation, ochkovtiralitstva. That is yet another Russian word for lying, usually used when you're lying to make something sound a lot better than it is, often yourself. Take away any one of these three limbs and the system becomes unstable. Without lies, the system has to deal with the consequences of its own inadequacy, and both day-to-day functioning and securing public support becomes very difficult. Without corruption, systems of patronage and purchased loyalty become difficult to sustain. And without a political system that encourages division, duplication, and competition, well, then the central power structure behind it all becomes vulnerable. But likewise, it's hard to see how you overcome any of these three features while the other two remain in place. Maybe the management consultants over at Wagner Group have a couple of ideas. In conclusion, when